The shovel bit into the Virginia clay as 15-year-old Dinah Green dug in the night air, sweat running down her face even though the summer breeze was cool. From the pit below, Lawrence Fletcher's cries were fading, muffled beneath the weight of earth she kept throwing over him. His drugged mind fought to stay awake, his terrified eyes staring up at her while the soil swallowed him inch by inch. She had suffered his assaults long enough, and beneath the old oak tree that had seen generations of pain on the Fletcher plantation, the master's heir was finally paying his debt. But Dinah's story didn't begin with revenge. It began with loss. Born in 1825, she barely remembered her mother. Her earliest memories were soft hands braiding her hair and a lullaby drifting through the quarters at night. Then at 3 years old, she lost her mother forever. Rose collapsed in the cotton fields during a brutal harvest. Her body left under burlap sacks until the overseers decided the day's labor was done. The rows of cotton shone white in the sun, cruel in their beauty, as if mocking the sacrifice of the woman who had given her life to them. From that day forward, Dinah was raised by the women of the quarters who balanced caring for her with tending to their own children, all of them trapped under the same yoke. She grew up in the shadow of the Fletcher mansion, its tall white columns towering over 300 acres of tobacco and cotton. Since 1768, the family had claimed the land stolen from native people and built its wealth on the backs of the enslaved. By 1840, when Dinah's life reached its breaking point, the plantation held 47 enslaved souls, each one forced to keep the machine of profit running while getting nothing in return but hunger, exhaustion, and grief. The Fletcher family themselves were a portrait of entitlement. Robert Fletcher, the master, was a heavy drinker with a red face and little patience. His wife Constance, thin and cold, commanded the household with sharp words and a sharper tongue. And then there was their only son, Lawrence. At 23, he had inherited both his father's bulk and his mother's icy stare. He believed the plantation and everyone on it was his to use as he wished. Dinah had worked the fields until she was 12, her hands blistered and scarred from picking under the burning sun. When her body began to change, the overseers took notice, and soon after, Constance declared her fit for house duty. It was supposed to be a step up, but life in the big house came with its own dangers. The work was endless, the hours long, and invisibility became her only shield. She learned how to move without a sound, which floors groaned underfoot, which doors stuck in the frame, and how to appear only when needed. And it was in those halls under that roof that Lawrence returned from college in 1838. He carried himself as though he had learned refinement, but behind the practiced manners lay the same arrogance as before, only sharper. He noticed Dinah almost immediately. "Would you like me to continue rewriting the rest of this story in the same style and flow?" His eyes followed her as she served dinner, carried laundry, and cleaned the rooms. At first just looks the kind of predatory attention that made Dinah's skin crawl and left her breathing shallow with fear. And 3 months after his return, the first assault came in the spring of 1839. She had been dusting the library surrounded by leather-bound books the Fletchers kept more for show than use, when Lawrence locked the door, and there was nowhere to go and no one to help. When it was over, he smoothed his clothes and walked away as if nothing had happened. And Dinah stayed on the floor staring at volumes full of knowledge that offered no mercy. She told no one because there was no one who could protect her. Master Robert would not trust a slave girl's word against his son, and Constance would more likely blame Dinah for tempting him than defend her. This was the brutal reality of enslavement, where black women were treated as property and white men took what they wanted with impunity. The assaults continued through 1839 and into 1840, sometimes spaced out, sometimes closer together, always on Lawrence's schedule. Dinah learned to read the signs, the way his eyes fixed on her during meals, the particular tone he used when he summoned her to a room he occupied. and she learned to float above her body during the worst moments, focusing on small details, like the crack patterns in a ceiling or the sound of a bird outside the window, so she would not lose her mind. Survival reshaped her life. She stopped joining the singing, the stories, and the laughter in the quarters, the small resistances that kept everyone going. And she ate less until Constance complained she looked ill and forced her to eat so she would not be unbecoming when guests arrived. Sleep became impossible without nightmares, and she would wake in the dark biting her hand to keep from screaming. Ruth, an older woman in the quarters who had survived decades of bondage and knew healing herbs, and the old councils noticed Dinah's decline and began sitting with her in the evenings, asking nothing, only offering presents. One humid night in late June of 1840, as fireflies blinked in the yard, Ruth told her that sometimes a body has to do terrible things to survive, and sometimes the only way to stop a wolf is to kill it. And Dinah heard in that quiet statement permission to stop feeling helpless. She started watching Lawrence more closely, cataloging his habits, noting that he drank most evenings, that he took an opium tincture to sleep after his drinking, and that his carelessness came from the conviction that consequences would never touch him. The ingredient for a plan lived in plain sight in the medicine cabinet of the main house, where Constance kept remedies and bottles of laudanum for everyday complaints. Dinah knew where the key was kept and had seen Constance fetch it many times, and the idea of taking a bottle and saving it for the right moment planted itself in her mind and would not leave. Dinah moved through the house like a shadow, every muscle burning as she dragged Lawrence across the polished boards, his boots clawing at the floor until the library door swallowed them. And the night air hit her face, and she kept going, hauling him down the back steps, across the yard, past the servants' quarters where the lantern light was low and the breathing steady, past the rows of planted tobacco that rustled like a crowd of quiet witnesses, and finally to the old oak whose roots had held up the plantation for generations. She had chosen that spot because the ground there was softer, because the tree had seen so much and seemed to promise that the earth would keep secrets. Her arms shook as she lowered his weight into the shallow pit she had dug earlier that day, dirt sticking to her palms, moonlight sketching the contours of his face. And for a moment she stood very still, listening to her own blood and the distant sound of a dog barking and the slow, indifferent chirp of a cricket. There was no hatred in her hands, only the exhaustion of someone pushed beyond endurance. And as she pushed the shovel into the clay and began to heap earth over him, his eyes moved once toward her, confused and dim and somehow pleading. And she thought of the library and its leather-bound lies, and of the women in the quarters who had raised her, and of Ruth who had sat with her and said the words that allowed a plan to form. Each shovelful was a release, and each hit of the soil felt like both an ending and a beginning. She covered his face until the shape beneath the dirt blurred into the ground itself, and then she tamped the earth down, smoothed the rim with the back of her shovel, and let the night reclaim its silence. There was no ceremony, only the heavy breaths that filled her lungs, and the sudden strange lightness that came from knowing this horror could no longer be repeated, and she washed her hands at the cistern until the water ran clear, and then crept back toward the house, wiping the dirt from her skirt, and moving with the practiced quiet of someone who had spent years learning how to be invisible. The next days were a careful acting out of normalcy. She performed every task as if nothing had changed, answering to orders, setting plates, carrying water, and all the while watching for the ripple that would tell her whether the plantation had noticed its missing heir. Rumors moved like smoke, and when questions finally came, they were soft and circuitous, asked more to spare feelings than to find truth. And Dinah kept her face like stone. Ruth sat with her again and offered no congratulations, only a look that acknowledged the terrible cost of what had been done and the way survival sometimes required sacrificing a piece of the self. In the weeks that followed, there were tense moments when a rider returned early from Richmond. or when Constance woke from her laudanum haze and paced the halls with suspicion. But the earth held its secret, and the Fletcher family, shaken in ways they refused to name, began to rearrange themselves around the absence. Dinah did not feel triumphant. She felt emptied and wary, as if she had stepped over a line that changed everything. She kept working, kept moving through rooms and fields. But she also began to rebuild the small, stubborn life inside her, tending to the quiet joys that had once felt forbidden, listening to the songs in the quarters, learning to laugh again in private. Justice had been buried beneath an old oak, and though it would never bring back what was lost, it had stopped a wolf from hunting in the dark. And for now, that was enough. Dinah dragged Lawrence through the night air, her lungs burning as the humid Virginia heat clung to her skin, the cicada's steady chorus hiding the scrape of boots and the thud of his body against the ground. The oak loomed ahead, its massive limbs stretching wide across the yard like a dark sentinel, and with each step, she told herself there was no turning back. When they reached its base, she let him drop his moans, weak and drug-slowed, and ran to the shed for the shovel she had prepared. Her hand shook so violently she nearly dropped it, but she forced herself forward, digging furiously, the soil softer than the hard clay fields, but still heavy and stubborn. Time was closing in on her. Constance might stir, someone might notice Lawrence missing, or worse, the drug could wear off and his strength return. She dug until the pit was deep enough to swallow a body, not perfect, not safe forever, but all she could manage. Lawrence's eyes were clearer now, his slurred attempts at words breaking into groans that chilled her. She ignored them, seized him by the arms again, and dragged him to the edge of the hole. With one last surge, she tipped him in his body, hitting the earth with a dull thud. He lay staring up at her, horror dawning in his gaze as he realized where he was and what was happening. His mouth opened to scream, and Dinah, heart-pounding, snatched up the shovel and hurled the first load of dirt into the grave. It struck his chest, cutting off his cry into a strangled gasp. He began to thrash, clawing desperately at the walls of the pit, his hands slipping against the loose soil, his muffled screams breaking through the night like an animal caught in a trap. But Dinah did not stop. She shoveled faster, each heave of dirt fueled by years of humiliation, terror, and grief, the pit filling around him, inch by inch, his body disappearing beneath the earth. The more he fought, the harder she worked, until the dirt climbed over his chest, his neck, and finally, his face, silencing him beneath the weight of the ground. Lawrence fought with everything he had left, twisting his head to keep his face free, clawing at the earth as if sheer desperation could hold back the inevitable. But the dirt kept falling heavy and relentless, each shovelful, burying him deeper in silence. Dinah's arms ached, her whole body quaking with exhaustion and horror. But she could not stop, not now. Not when stopping meant her own death, her own torture, her own erasure. His screams weakened as the soil filled his mouth and nose, his chest crushed beneath the weight of the ground. His hands, once frantic, slowed and curled against the crumbling walls of the pit. For one last moment, Dinah saw his eyes staring up at her through a thin layer of dirt, wide with terror, filled with an accusation she knew she would never escape. Then came stillness. No more thrashing, no more cries. Only silence. She stood frozen, shovel in hand, staring into the grave she had made. Lawrence Fletcher, heir to the plantation, was dead, buried alive beneath the oak tree that had witnessed centuries of pain. But there was no time for grief, no time for the relief or the guilt to settle in. She worked mechanically, throwing the rest of the earth into the hole, tamping it flat with her feet. In the back of the shovel, disguising the grave with leaves and fallen branches, until it looked like nothing more than a bare patch of soil. She returned the shovel to the shed, wiping it carefully with her apron and placing it exactly as it had been. At the well, She washed herself, scrubbing dirt from her hands and face, splashing cold water until her skin stung, as if she could wash away not just the soil, but the act itself. The main house was quiet when she slipped back inside. She cleaned the library with shaking hands, washed the brandy glass over and over, straightened the chair, smoothed the bookshelves until it looked as though Lawrence had simply spent the evening reading. Then she carried the bottle of laudanum back to the quarters, hiding it under the loose floorboard. With her meager treasures, her mother's broken comb, a smooth river stone, a scrap of blue cloth. Lying down on her pallet, still in her dress, she stared at the ceiling through the long hours of night. Around her, the others slept there, breathing deep and steady, while every sound outside made her heart lurch. The groan of the building, the cry of a night bird, the rustle of branches in the wind. But the night stayed quiet, and when dawn broke, gray light creeping into the quarters, no alarm had been raised. Life resumed as if nothing had happened. Dinah rose with the others, numb and hollow, moving through her chores like a ghost. She helped prepare breakfast in the big house, set the table with steady hands, and when Constance Fletcher drifted in late from her laudanum haze, the first words out of her mouth were, "Where is Lawrence?" Dinah's voice, calm and controlled, despite the storm raging in her chest, gave the only answer she could. She had not seen him that morning. When Lawrence failed to appear for breakfast, alarm spread quickly through the household. He was not the type to skip meals, and by mid-morning the family had grown uneasy. Servants searched the mansion from attic to cellar, then swept across the grounds and out to the fields where Lawrence sometimes rode. By midday, with no trace of him, Constance Fletcher was trembling on the edge of hysteria, demanding that every enslaved person be questioned. A rider was sent racing toward Richmond to summon Master Robert home with the grim news. Dinah, along with the others, was called in one by one. She kept her story simple, steady, unshaken. She had last seen Lawrence in the library the night before when she served him brandy. He dismissed her, and she returned to the quarters. Nothing more. The overseer eyed her with suspicion, as he did with all of them. But she was small, quiet, and had long been a house servant with no history of defiance. He moved on. For now her secret held. The next days were heavy with fear. Constance swung between wild claims that her son had been murdered by the enslaved, and desperate fantasies that he had wandered off and would one day return. Patrols scoured the countryside hunting for fugitives, convinced that if Lawrence was dead, someone must have fled in guilt. When Robert Fletcher returned, his grief hardened into fury. Interrogations turned brutal. Men from the fields were tied to posts and whipped until their backs ran red, but the overseers learned nothing. Only Dinah knew the truth, and she kept her silence while guilt gnawed at her as she watched others suffer in her place. Through it all, the oak tree stood untouched, its broad shadow shielding the grave. Dinah's careful covering disguised the soil, and the tree's shade had long prevented grass from growing thick beneath it. No one thought to look closer. 5 feet down, Lawrence Fletcher lay hidden, his body returning slowly to the earth. Weeks passed, then months. Lawrence's absence became a wound the family could not close. Constance clung to her fantasy of his miraculous return, whispering that perhaps he had lost his memory, that someday he would come riding back through the gates. Robert, more practical, accepted what she would not say aloud: his son was almost certainly dead. Yet without a body, mourning remained unfinished, and the plantation lived under a pall of suspicion and unease. Dinah bore her own burden. Night after night she woke shaking, drenched in sweat, haunted by dreams of Lawrence's dirt-covered face staring up at her, by the echo of muffled screams, by the weight of the shovel in her hands. The relief of freedom from his violence was tempered by the memory of how she had taken it. Only Ruth seemed to sense the truth, her quiet gaze carrying understanding, but never accusation. She had spoken once of wolves that must be killed, and that was enough. In the quarters, whispers about the oak tree grew into legend. Some swore they heard cries rising from its roots, the desperate voice of someone buried alive. Others claimed they heard singing low, mournful, like a chorus of spirits bound to the soil. A few even spoke of strange lights beneath the branches, flickering like fireflies, yet moving too deliberately to be natural. Dinah listened, her heart tightening, unsure whether these stories were superstition or something far more real. She avoided the oak whenever she could, taking longer routes to the main house. But at times she had no choice but to walk beneath its looming canopy. When she did, she felt its ancient weight pressing down on her, as if the tree itself was keeping her secret, biding its time until it chose to reveal it. Briggs the overseer grew more convinced with each passing month that Lawrence had been murdered by one of the enslaved men in the fields. His cruelty deepened as he ordered endless searches. Men forced to dig trenches through the tobacco rows, barns and sheds torn apart. Even the pond at the edge of the property drained in hopes of finding a body. But not once did Briggs order anyone to dig beneath the oak tree. That tree was too much a part of the landscape, too rooted in memory, too permanent to seem like a hiding place. Its presence was so ordinary, it became invisible. 2 years slipped by. Dinah turned 17. In that time, the absence of Lawrence's predatory presence gave her the first fragile space to heal. She began joining the others again in the evenings, singing, telling stories, and laughing in the small moments of joy that served as rebellion against their bondage. In the main house, she still worked with quiet precision, but the dread that had once coiled in her stomach each time she caught Lawrence's stare was gone. Yet the oak tree remained heavy with unease. Strange stories grew around it, whispered in the quarters at night. Jacob, a young field hand, swore he saw Lawrence's ghost one evening, staggering toward the tree with dirt clinging to his translucent form. Patience, one of the elders, said she heard a voice calling faintly from beneath the earth itself, begging for help, though when she stopped to listen, there was only silence. Robert Fletcher, consumed by grief and suspicion, turned to desperate measures. In 1841, he brought in a medium from Richmond, a man named Aldridge, who claimed to commune with the dead and charged dearly for it. Dinah, serving refreshments that night, kept her face still as Aldridge performed his theatrics in the flickering light of the parlor, declaring that Lawrence's spirit was restless, that he could not rest until his body was laid properly in the family ground. The seance produced nothing but vague pronouncements, yet it was enough to inflame Robert's obsession again. He ordered new excavations this time, following the medium's suggestions, and for days, the enslaved people were forced to dig and dig holes gouged out of the plantation, only to be filled back in. Dinah moved through those days with her chest tight, every stroke of the shovel around her a reminder of what lay hidden. She feared someone might glance at the oak and think to dig beneath it, yet at the same time she was grimly amazed at how invisible the grave remained. Men and women trudged past it daily, their shadows falling across the very soil that covered Lawrence, and no one saw. The tree, it seemed, was keeping the secret, its sprawling roots and ancient canopy guarding what lay beneath. Lawrence's body remained there, returning slowly to the soil that had fueled his family's fortune. In the fall of 1842, nature itself struck the plantation. A storm rolled through Virginia, the kind people would talk about for years. Winds howled, rain came in sheets, and the fields flooded. Several of the outbuildings were left sagging or broken, and the great oak, 2 centuries old, unshaken by so many tempests before, lost one of its largest branches. The massive limb cracked and thundered to the ground, shattering in the storm. And with it, the secret Dinah had buried 2 years earlier trembled on the edge of discovery. The storm's fury left the plantation shaken, but it was the oak tree that delivered the deepest blow. When its great branch fell, it ripped open the earth and exposed what had been hidden for 2 long years. Among the torn soil lay scraps of rotted cloth and the pale gleam of bone. The enslaved who first saw it froze in horror before rushing to report to Robert Fletcher. By afternoon, overseers and patrols were digging furiously beneath the oak. What they unearthed was unmistakable the skeleton of Lawrence Fletcher. His identity confirmed by remnants of his fine clothes and the objects buried with him. The sight chilled everyone present. His arms were raised toward the surface, hands twisted upward as if clawing for air, confirming what the whispers soon repeated. Lawrence had been buried alive. Word spread quickly, neighbors arriving to gawk, horrified at the idea of such a death befalling the heir of Fletcher Plantation. Dinah kept to the edges, her face expressionless, as Lawrence's remains were lifted from the soil. Inside, her heart thundered with fear that discovery would lead to her downfall. Yet alongside the terror was something darker, a grim satisfaction. His death had not been clean, not gentle, but suffocating terror, an echo of what he had inflicted upon her. The investigation reignited with ferocity. Robert Fletcher demanded answers, convinced a killer walked among the enslaved. Each person was questioned again, this time under harsher measures. Briggs, the overseer, bore down on Dinah for hours, trying threats, intimidation, even false promises of mercy. But she kept to her story, the one she had spoken for 2 years. She had last seen Lawrence in the library, serving him brandy before being dismissed to the quarters. It was simple, consistent, and carried the weight of plausibility. Too many had access to the house, too many opportunities. There was no proof, only suspicion spread across dozens of bowed heads. Lawrence's funeral was a spectacle. The Fletcher family laid him to rest in the family plot with pomp and sorrow, neighbors and ministers offering words that recast him as a promising young man, cut down unjustly. Reverend Michael praised his virtues, speaking of honor, intelligence, and charm, as though Lawrence had been a saint. From the back, where the enslaved stood in silence, Dinah bit down hard on her tongue to keep from laughing at the lies being spoken over the coffin. The world was burying not the man he truly was, but the myth of him. The official search for his killer slowly unraveled into nothing. No evidence surfaced, no informants claimed the reward Robert offered. The tale of Lawrence Fletcher's mysterious death spread through the county and beyond, each retelling, adding new layers until it became more legend than truth. In the winter of 1843, Ruth's body finally gave out after decades of toil. Dinah sat with her as she struggled to breathe, clutching the old woman's frail hand. Ruth's final words were barely more than a whisper. "You did what you had to, child. Don't let it poison the rest of your life. Some wolves need killing." Those words sank deep into Dinah's heart, a kind of absolution she carried forward. Life on the plantation shifted into decline. Constance Fletcher, lost in grief, retreated almost entirely into her laudanum haze, fading year by year. Robert Fletcher drank harder, his temper souring into cruelty, his face ruddy and bloated as his authority grew unstable. The enslaved bore the weight of his rage, punished for his sorrow. The oak tree stood scarred but unbroken, its lost branch leaving a jagged wound along its trunk. It became infamous, a place of dark pilgrimage. Neighbors whispered of it as cursed ground. Visitors came from nearby plantations to see the tree that had sheltered the grave of Lawrence Fletcher, the heir who had clawed at the earth until it silenced him. Stories grew in the telling of his spirit, wandering of voices crying from beneath the roots of lights, flickering like trapped souls. For Dinah, the tree was both a monument to her survival and a shadow she could never escape, its looming presence, a constant reminder of the night she traded innocence for freedom beneath its branches. Some swore the oak still whispered, that on certain nights the wind carried voices from beneath its roots. Songs too mournful to be human, or cries too faint to belong to the living. Dinah never knew if those stories were real, if Lawrence's spirit truly lingered there, or if it was just the fear and guilt of those who lived in the shadow of the tree. She only knew the sound stayed with her long after she was gone. In 1847, when she was 22, death came for the old masters. Robert Fletcher collapsed from a stroke, his body giving out after years of bourbon and bitterness had worn him down. Constance followed within a month, slipping away in her laudanum haze, her heart simply failing in her sleep. The plantation, drowning in debt, passed not to a son or daughter, but to a distant cousin from South Carolina named William Fletcher. William had never met Lawrence and cared little for the mystery that had consumed Robert and Constance. To him, the plantation was only an asset to be trimmed and made profitable. He ordered sales at once, men, women, and children broken from their families to settle accounts. Dinah was among those sold. At 17, she had killed Lawrence Fletcher. At 22, she was chained and marched south, her body bartered like cattle. She carried with her only the clothes on her back and the secret that bound her forever to the oak tree. As the wagon rattled away from Fletcher Plantation, she turned her head for one last look. The tree rose against the gray sky, scarred but unbowed, its branches spreading wide, like arms raised in judgment. In its shadow lay both her crime and her survival. The Garrett family in North Carolina bought her. Their farm was smaller, their house humbler, but the cruelty of enslavement was no less sharp. Dinah worked in the fields and in the kitchen, beaten down by endless labor, yet free at least from the particular terror that had haunted her youth. Years passed. She grew older, wiser, harder, and still she listened to whispers of abolitionists, of uprisings, of a country pulling itself toward a reckoning. Those whispers lit a spark in her chest, the smallest flame of hope. In 1859, when Dinah was 34, a man calling himself Brother Paul came through the quarters. A preacher with coded words about the River Jordan and crossing to the Promised Land. He was part of the Underground Railroad. He sought Dinah out, telling her he saw in her the strength of someone who had already survived more than most. He offered her a chance, follow the North Star, risk everything, and claim freedom. It was dangerous capture, meant torture, even death. But Dinah had faced worse. She remembered Lawrence's eyes staring up from the grave, the weight of the shovel in her hands, and she realized she had already done the hardest thing she would ever do. That winter, on a moonless night, Dinah slipped from the Garrett farm. Her heart pounded as she moved through the trees, each crack of a twig sounding like thunder, each distant bark of a dog like a death knell. She traveled by night, hid by day, following Brother Paul's directions from one safe house to the next. Quaker families, freedmen, and abolitionists of every kind risked their lives to help her north. The journey stretched across 3 brutal months, marked by hunger, cold, and the gnawing fear of capture. But Dinah pressed on. She crossed rivers in silence, rode wagons hidden under hay, walked for miles with blistered feet, guided always by the North Star. Along the way, she heard the stories of others, fleeing mothers torn from their children, men scarred by the lash women who carried pain in silence like she once had. Their stories fueled her legs, kept her moving towards something she had never dared to believe possible. In the winter of 1860, Dinah crossed into Pennsylvania, the border of a free state. She stood on that frozen ground, trembling, hardly believing it was real. In Philadelphia, she found work with a Quaker family who asked no questions about her past. For the first time, Dinah Green was not property. For the first time, she was free. For the first time, Dinah knew what it meant to labor for herself. The coins she earned in the Williamson household felt strange in her hands. Small, ordinary things, yet heavier with meaning than any chain she had ever worn. The Williamsons were abolitionists, their home a haven for the cause, and Mrs. Williamson, in particular, saw in Dinah not just a servant, but a witness. She urged her to share her story at gatherings, to give voice to the horrors she had endured, so that those who claimed not to know the truth of slavery could no longer look away. At first, Dinah resisted, terrified that in telling her truth she might let slip the secret she had buried with Lawrence Fletcher. But as she listened to others speak, men who had been whipped until their backs were scars, women who had been forced to give up children, sold south, she realized her suffering was not singular, only one face of a larger cruelty. So she began to speak. She told of the endless toil, the lash, the constant fear. She spoke of being made into property of the master's son, who used her body as he pleased, though she never confessed how his assaults had ended. Her words cut through the rooms where she spoke, leaving people shaken, some in tears, others silent with shame. And with each retelling, Dinah discovered a power she had never known, the power of her own voice. When war came in 1861, she devoured the news with a hunger she hadn't expected. Mrs. Williamson taught her to read, and soon Dinah could follow the battles and speeches herself. Every Union victory felt like a personal triumph. Every Confederate defeat was another stone falling from the wall that had caged her life. And when Lincoln's proclamation of emancipation was read aloud in 1863, Dinah wept openly, not just for herself, but for those she had left behind, the ones still trapped in bondage on plantations like Fletcher's, perhaps still waiting for freedom to arrive, like a miracle they dared not believe in. The war's end in 1865 brought not only liberation, but also reckoning. Dinah found herself circling back to the memory that had haunted her for a quarter of a century. In the larger tide of history, in a nation that had killed hundreds of thousands to break slavery, the night she buried Lawrence Fletcher seemed less a crime than a desperate act of survival. In another world, the law might have called it self-defense. In hers, it had been murder. It was that tension, the gulf between guilt and justice, that pushed her toward a decision that startled even her. She would return to Virginia. She would stand once more before the oak tree and confront the soil where her past was buried. Mrs. Williamson begged her not to go, warning that the South was still raw and dangerous for black people, free or not. But Dinah's mind was set. This journey was nothing like her flight north in fear and darkness. She traveled with her head high, her free papers in hand, moving through a broken South where white men glared and spat, but no longer held chains over her. Each mile brought her closer to Fletcher Plantation, to the house where she had been a shadow, and to the tree whose roots still wrapped around her life. She did not know what she would feel when she stood before it again, only that she had to. Dinah's journey south in the summer of 1866 carried her through a scarred land, past charred plantations, ruined towns, and fields left to weeds. The war had erased much of the old world. Yet when she reached Fletcher Plantation, she found its decay strangely personal. The grand mansion, once a symbol of wealth and cruelty, was reduced to blackened stone and a lone chimney. The fields were wild with briars, the quarters hollow shells of wood and ash. But the oak tree remained towering and immovable, its branches stretching wide, as though nothing in the world had changed. She approached it with a pounding heart, her hand trembling as she pressed her palm against its bark. It was solid, eternal, as though it had swallowed centuries of human suffering and held them tight within its roots. Dinah thought of Lawrence's bones far below, wondered if they had been pulled apart by the creeping roots and absorbed into the tree itself. The thought sent a shiver through her, but she did not pull her hand away. Simon, an old man who had stayed behind after emancipation, found her there. He was stooped, his beard gray, his eyes lined with years of hard labor. But he remembered her. They spoke quietly about the years between. Simon told her that strange things still clung to the oak, that at night people swore they heard voices rising from beneath the soil, sometimes crying, sometimes singing, as though the ground itself could not forget. Some said it was Lawrence Fletcher's restless spirit, Others believed it was the chorus of all the enslaved who had suffered and died there. Simon gave her a long, searching look, as if he suspected she carried the truth in her silence. But he did not press her. For several days, Dinah walked the land of her childhood. She stood in the field where her mother had collapsed and died. Now nothing but weeds and silence. She wandered through the ruins of the house where she had been a shadow, silent and unseen. And she returned always to the oak tree as if drawn to it by threads she could not sever. On her final evening beneath a sunset that set the sky ablaze, she spoke to Lawrence Fletcher's ghost, or perhaps only to the wind. She told him she did not regret what she had done, that his death had been the price of her survival, that in a just world, she would never have been forced to choose between his life and her own humanity. She told him that each assault had been a shovel full of earth he had thrown into his own grave. And as she finished, the wind swept through the branches with a sound that could have been voices, could have been song, or could have been nothing at all. The tree gave no answer. It kept its secrets as it always had. And Dinah, for the first time, was content to let it. She left Virginia the next morning and never returned. Back in Philadelphia, she devoted herself to her community. She worked tirelessly with the abolitionist cause as it shifted into the fight for Reconstruction and the rights of the freed. She spoke in churches and meeting halls, her voice steady as she recounted her life in bondage. Not the whole story, never the whole truth, but enough to move her listeners and keep alive the memory of what slavery had done. Dinah never married, never bore children, but she became a mother of sorts to others in the freed community, helping to raise and guide those who came north seeking lives of dignity. She worked for the Williamsons until Mrs. Williamson's death in 1878, then continued as a cook and housekeeper, always respected, always steady though, always carrying the weight of what she had done. And though she never again saw Fletcher Plantation, she carried the image of the oak tree with her until her last days. To her, it was not just the sight of horror and death. It was also the place where she had seized her freedom, however terrible the price. In the last decades of her life, Dinah lived with humility and caution, saving what little she earned and always mindful that freedom in America was fragile for a black woman. She thought often of the choices she had made, especially that night beneath the oak. By law, she had been a murderer. By the cruel logic of survival, she had been a woman reclaiming her humanity in the only way left to her. She spoke of it only once to a minister who had himself escaped bondage. He told her that God weighed the heart, not the circumstances, and that slavery had twisted the world so badly that it forced people into sins that were not truly their own. His words gave her some measure of peace, but never complete release. In the 1880s, whispers of the old plantation began to spread north. Travelers told tales of the oak of lights flickering around its roots, of cries in the night that seemed to come from beneath the earth. Some even sought Dinah out in Philadelphia, asking what she knew. She always deflected, saying only that enslaved people told stories to endure their suffering. But privately, she wondered if those voices were real, if they were Lawrence's cries echoing forever in the soil, or if they were the chorus of all who had suffered and died there, their pain seeping into the tree's ancient marrow. Then, in 1892, news came that struck her like a thunderclap. The oak tree had been hit by lightning during a violent storm, split from crown to root. Its interior torn open, the earth around its base exposed. Workers found bones and rotted cloth, not just remnants of Lawrence, but of others, at least 3 more bodies buried in shallow hidden graves. The skeletons bore signs of violence. Likely enslaved people murdered and discarded, their deaths never recorded. The newspapers called them the lost souls of Fletcher Plantation. Reading the reports, Dinah felt an unexpected sense of justice. Lawrence was no longer alone in the soil. His bones lay mingled with those of the very people his family had tormented and erased. In death, he was not a singular tragedy, but one body among many victims of the system that had sustained him. The oak had been keeping not just her secret, but the secrets of countless cruelties. Now exposed by lightning, those truths refused to stay buried. Debates raged over what should be done. Some argued the remains should be carefully exhumed and reburied with dignity. Others insisted they should be left where they were, as a memorial, the ground itself serving as witness. Writers and reformers seized on the story as proof that the land carried memory, that the very soil of the South was haunted by slavery's violence. For Dinah, the news carried a strange relief. What she had done no longer stood apart. Lawrence Fletcher's death had become part of a larger story, not just of her survival, but of a brutal system that had devoured lives without count. The oak tree's roots had wrapped around all of them, and when the lightning split it open, the world could no longer look away. Dinah carried her secret to the grave. She never spoke of Lawrence Fletcher's death, never admitted her role in the night he vanished beneath the oak, never explained how at least one of the bones later unearthed had come to lie in that soil. She had lived with the knowledge for more than half a century, balancing guilt against survival, silence against freedom. By the time she reached her 70s, she no longer sought absolution. She had endured, she had resisted, she had lived to see the system that had tormented her fall into ash that she decided was enough. In Philadelphia, her final years were quiet. She lived in a modest apartment sustained by a small pension from charitable work and the support of neighbors who respected her as a matriarch in their community. She read often, attended church faithfully, and welcomed younger generations into her home, to tell them of slavery's cruelty, not with bitterness, but with the gravity of someone who knew history must be remembered if it was ever to be buried for good. She was regarded as an elder, a survivor whose presence bridged past and present. In 1898, Dinah Green died peacefully in her sleep at 73. She was laid to rest in a cemetery for Black residents of Philadelphia. Her headstone bore only her name and years of birth and death, giving no hint of the extraordinary life she had lived, nor of the night in 1840 when she seized her own fate with trembling hands and a shovel. Yet her funeral drew dozens, neighbors, church members, fellow survivors of bondage, who came not to mourn a hidden crime, but to honor a life of endurance, advocacy, and quiet strength. The oak tree on Fletcher Plantation outlasted her by only a few decades. The lightning strike that split it in 1892 left it mortally wounded. For a handful of years it remained standing, a dead monument, with branches clawing at the sky like bones. In the 1930s, another storm finally toppled it. The new landowners cleared away what remained, cutting up the trunk and leaving only a depression in the earth where its vast roots had spread. But the oak did not vanish from memory. Its legend grew passed down in Virginia folklore as the story of the singing tree. Some said voices still rose from the ground where it had stood. Wails of the lost souls, songs of grief and vengeance carried on the night wind. Some told of Lawrence Fletcher buried alive by unknown hands, clawing at the dirt until his voice gave out. Others spoke of the enslaved whose unmarked graves had been found there, victims of a system that had written them out of history until the oak exposed their remains. Few tales named Dinah, and none told the whole truth. She disappeared into the larger shadow of the plantation, remembered only as one of many anonymous lives swallowed by slavery. Yet in smaller circles among freed families and their descendants, whispers endured of a girl who had fought back, who had turned terror into resistance. Her name was lost, her story blurred, but the message remained: enslaved. People had not been voiceless, nor entirely powerless. They had resisted in every way they could, sometimes in songs and prayers, sometimes in silence and endurance, and sometimes in violence that could not be judged by ordinary laws. Today the plantation is gone. Divided into farms and homes, the cotton fields replaced by new lives that rarely think of the past. Only the shallow bowl in the earth, where the oak's roots once spread, marks the spot of centuries of suffering and the secrets it held. But for those who know the stories, the ground itself still feels heavy, as if it remembers. Local historians eventually placed a marker on the land where the oak tree once stood, noting that human remains had been uncovered there and that the site should be remembered as a place of slavery's violence. Visitors still come drawn by the stories of Fletcher Plantation and its haunted tree. Some stand in the shallow depression where its roots once spread and swear they hear faint voices singing or crying or whispering beneath the earth. Others hear nothing more than wind in the leaves of younger trees, birdsong, and the hum of modern traffic. Whether the voices are real or imagined matters less than what the stories represent. They are a reminder of what happened in that place. The cruelty of bondage, the suffering of the enslaved, and the desperate acts of resistance that survival sometimes required. They tell of Lawrence Fletcher, who grew up believing his position gave him the right to use and destroy the people his family owned, and who died buried alive beneath the tree that had stood over generations of suffering. They also tell in fragments and whispers of a girl named Dinah, who refused to remain a victim. Her name rarely appears in retellings, and the official histories never record her choice. But in the memory of Black communities passed down in quiet conversations and oral traditions, there remains the story of a girl who fought back. Not with weapons of war or words in court, but with the only means left to her, a shovel the earth and her own resolve. She lived on escaped slavery and saw freedom declared, carrying with her both the burden of that night and the strange triumph of survival. The oak tree itself is gone. Lawrence Fletcher's bones were moved to rest among his ancestors, the other bodies unearthed beneath the tree laid in a cemetery as victims of slavery. Dinah Green lies in Philadelphia, far from the Virginia soil that shaped and scarred her. Yet her story lingers bound to the land she left behind. Was she a murderer or simply a girl defending herself against a system that gave her no protection? Was her act a crime or an act of desperate justice? The answer lies beyond any single label. It was both terrible and necessary, both sin and survival. The oak kept her secret for more than a quarter century, and even when storms and lightning tore it open, the truth of Dinah's hand in Lawrence's death remained buried with her. On quiet nights when the wind stirs through the trees in that part of Virginia, some say you can still hear the singing. Perhaps it is Lawrence's spirit crying out. Perhaps it is the voices of the enslaved rising in sorrow and endurance. Or perhaps it is simply the sound of history refusing to be silenced. Dinah Green's story is the story of slavery itself. Violence and resistance intertwined, horror and survival, bound together. She was both victim and killer, both destroyed and defiant. Her act beneath the oak tree was not just a personal tragedy, but a small rebellion against a world that sought to crush her. The tree is gone, but the memory remains, reminding us that history is not just written in ledgers and monuments, but in the impossible choices made by those whom history tried to erase.